What Trump has been doing in the name of making America great again is actually destroying the industrial strategy itself. It's amazing he's gotten away with this.
What's missing in the progressive economic narrative right now?
I do think there needs to be a much stronger story and narrative of where all this value, for example, in Silicon Valley actually came from.
Instead of the tech billionaires getting richer and richer off the back of these inventions, designs, technology, shouldn't the government be demanding a greater return on its investments?
How did the billionaires get so rich in the first place?
How do you think Starmer's government is doing in the economic field? It's very unpopular. It's taken a lot of criticism from progressives.
The first problem is growth is not the mission. I keep telling them stop leading with fear because the hole will just become bigger.
Donald Trump's second term has already begun to reshape the global economic landscape, from a laundry list of tariffs to bigger tax cuts for billionaires to taking equity stakes in private companies. His policies are reverberating beyond the US. It's a shift that professor, author, and economist Mariana Mazzucato says isn't an industrial strategy, but it's destruction. Mazzucato, who was appointed to the Pontifical Academy for Life by the late Pope Francis for bringing more humanity to the world, has been a leading progressive figure in a mission-oriented industrial approach that drives innovation while also serving the public good. That approach is more necessary than ever, she argues, warning that when wages don't keep up with the cost of living, housing becomes unaffordable and public services deteriorate, leaving the door open for fascism to fill the void left by the lack of a hopeful progressive vision. Mariana Mazzucato, founding director of the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, joins me now. Mariana, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
Back in June, you said in an interview that Donald Trump is, quote, destroying all the progress made by previous US presidents. What is that progress in your view? And what do you consider to be some of the most damaging, dangerous economic decisions that Trump has made so far in his second term?
So it's interesting you said progress, because I'm not sure if I would have said progress. I think what I would have said is he's actually undermining the competitiveness of the United States, because in fact that competitiveness, and if you look at even the emergence of Silicon Valley, it all came from active mission-oriented state investments. And so when I wrote the book back in the day called The Entrepreneurial State, I said that the US famously would talk Jefferson, but act Hamilton. And now everyone knows what I mean because of the musical Hamilton, yes. But he was a big advocate back in the day on industrial strategy. And the truth is the US has always had an industrial strategy, but pretended they didn't. Europe actually hasn't had one. And what Trump has been doing in the name of making America great again is actually destroying the industrial strategy itself, going back to what we had in the 1600s, which was mercantilism. So just, tariffs, or thinking about trade wars and putting up walls. The idea that somehow it's just through exchange that you create growth as opposed to active investment. And so it's amazing he's gotten away with this because, in fact, the U.S. has needed an industrial policy. It finally got one in recent years in a more explicit way through Joe Biden. Again, they've always had an implicit industrial strategy. And, Biden's CHIPS Act, the IRA, these were examples of not perfect, but, active state investments, which actually were quite successful. And he's now currently, I wouldn't say destroying it, but actually in a very strategic way, taking away the bits that actually weren't progressive. So the CHIPS Act, for example, had conditionality linked to the way that semiconductor companies would access government support. So there was conditions, for example, that the companies wouldn't be able to use share buybacks, just buying back their shares to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay. If you're getting money from government, you should reinvest those profits back in. There was conditions around working conditions and worker pay.
And he's getting rid of that.
So those are the things that he would get rid of precisely because actually they're progressive. So it's interesting what he's doing again in the name of making America great again, not only cutting these investments in certain places like the National Institutes of Health, but also in a very strategic way, taking away those things that actually help workers.
It's amazing that he gets away with this, you said, which is basically the epitaph of his entire presidency. On your Substack, Mission Economics, you warned that Trump's blanket tariffs will, quote, hurt global development, especially in the most vulnerable areas. You also said on Twitter that while tariffs can be legitimate tools for industrial strategy when used strategically, Trump's approach misses this nuance entirely. What you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that tariffs are not inherently, intrinsically, or always bad, but need to be used strategically. What would that look like?
Well, that's exactly then the point, going back to Alexander Hamilton, which is, he also used tariffs, as have many countries, in the periods in which they develop. So the whole infant industry argument in economics is that if you're trying to develop an industry and you put it, out there in competition with other countries right away, there won't be the time for that industry to actually learn, develop, invest, trial and error, because you're just going to sink right away through competition. Eventually, once that industry is competitive, it's correct to not have those tariffs so that it can compete. Now, again, I don't want to say that tariffs are always useful in that phase, but they're definitely useful as a part of a portfolio, if you want, of levers that a country with an industrial strategy would use. But if you don't have an industrial strategy, if you don't have, for example, all those different types of investments that the United States made back in the day that got us everything that's smart in our iPhones, so the internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, these were all government financed. In those periods, let's say in those early days of the internet or of the whole ICT revolution, the information communication technology revolution, it might have made sense for the US to have some tariffs to allow that industry to develop. But when you just have the tariffs, coming back to my point about mercantilism, then you really are just increasing the costs to the consumers in your own country. Why? Because without the industrial strategy, you won't even be able to produce those goods and services that now are sort of being blocked, if you want, from coming from other countries. So again, that's why the tariff and the industrial strategy have to go hand in hand, because if you're just making it harder for foreign countries to export to your country, and you aren't developing the capacity and capability to produce those goods yourself at the frontier of technology, it's not enough just to produce, right? You want goods that are innovative, that are high quality and accessible.
In terms of this administration, what it's doing, what do you make of then US Senator, now US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, quoting your work in his big Made in China economic report last year, which advocated for a comprehensive US industrial strategy to counter China? And then he comes to office and that report basically disappears, and nothing you've said seems to have made it into the positions of this administration. Liking this video? Then don't just watch, hit like, share and subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a video or live show. But if you want early access to exclusive content, then you have to head to zeteo.com and subscribe now. You'll be supporting fearless, independent journalism.
Well, what was interesting is he wrote both that report and another report in 2019. And I went to his team, asked me to visit them. I was in DC at the time. I was also visiting, ironically, at the same time of, talking to the Marco Rubio folks. I was talking to Elizabeth Warren and AOC and so on. And I also said to him, look, you're advocating for the same things that I hear the Democrats advocating for. Are you sure you're actually a Republican? And I remember his team said, well, the difference is that we actually also believe in family values.
Okay.
And I wasn't even sure what they meant by that. But I think what they tried to mean by that was, putting forth this position that somehow the Republicans care more about community, about people, about families, and the left, the Democrats, are potentially just about kind of top-down policies. Again, it was an incoherent response. But what's interesting, if you go back to 2019, when that report came out, was that, in fact, there wasn't an industrial strategy under Trump 1. Yep. So he was indirectly critiquing his boss. Then Biden comes along and actually introduces a very active industrial policy. Forget again whether it's good, it's bad. Industrial policy is always difficult. There's all sorts of different tools that you can use. You can use it wisely. You can use it in an intersectoral way, or you might just be picking winners, picking certain sectors. There's problems with that. But the point is, he revived this industrial policy, which Marco Rubio at the time was actually advocating for. And now Biden is actually, famously trying to, for example, take out equity stakes in some companies. Yes. And that's actually something I had written about in the entrepreneurial state, but not as a thing in itself. Again, it only makes sense if it's a tool. So at the time I had said it was extraordinary that, because I wrote the book back in 2013, that Obama had helped Tesla, for example, with a close to 500 million guaranteed loan. The same money went to Solyndra. Solyndra went bust. The taxpayer had to bail out Solyndra. And the agreement with Tesla was that if they didn't pay back the loan, the government wanted, this was the DOE, the Department of Energy loan, this is how it was structured, wanted 3 million shares in the company, which doesn't really make sense. You would want shares in the company if it's successful.
Yes.
So had they said, if you do pay back the loan, which they did in 2013, the loan was taken out in 2009, the price per share went from 9 to 90. That difference multiplied by 3 million would have more than paid back the Solyndra loss in the next round of investment.
Yes.
That's basically a public venture capitalist. Israel has Yozma, or had Yozma. That was like a public venture capital fund.
But Obama didn't do that, as you point out. And Trump is not doing that right now. He's not using it for the public good, these equity stakes. When it comes to progressives, you've said that their economic messaging needs a new narrative, one that goes beyond the typical messaging around taxation, regulation. What's missing in the progressive economic narrative right now?
So what I've actually been saying for years is that progressives are not winning the narrative on economic grounds, let alone sometimes in terms of the political narrative, because there's an over-focus on redistribution, but there's nothing to redistribute if you're not creating wealth.
Yes.
Right? So then the question is, what is a progressive and not a regressive way to create the wealth that then, of course, you need to redistribute? So that idea that you need to both create value and redistribute that value is really important. And then, second is, how do you do that? So it's not just ideology. But that first point is, I do think there needs to be a much stronger story and narrative of where all this value, for example, in Silicon Valley actually came from. It can't just be like tax the billionaires. Where did that value, how did the billionaires get so rich in the first place? On the back of massive public investments. And by the way, this is just as true for the pharmaceutical industry, which for decades has benefited in the US from close to 40 billion a year of dollars in health innovation. And then, the people who actually paid for it can't even access it because that's actually not part of the way that we're creating wealth. The government is, financing innovation here, and then separately in a whole other part of government thinking about its citizens through Medicare and Medicaid. And what's interesting is that the military actually usually thinks about them together. It would be crazy, for example, for DARPA that actually invested in the internet, as well as many military type investments, didn't worry that the soldiers would have access. Instead, for these kind of social areas like energy and health and so on, we don't think strategically, so the investments also then are accessible to people who eventually also paid for it.
You mentioned Silicon Valley. You've written about the myths of Silicon Valley, your famous book, The Entrepreneurial State from 2013. This idea that all of these technological advances are the result not just of entrepreneurial billionaire genius, but in fact, in reality, a lot of these technologies like GPS, touchscreens, AI assistants like Siri, Alexa, were developed through public funding by government agencies like DARPA at the Pentagon, like the CIA, like the US Navy. Instead of the tech billionaires getting richer and richer off the back of these inventions, designs, technology, shouldn't the government be demanding a greater return on its investments?
Absolutely. And again, I've been thinking a lot about it, but also working with certain governments around that. And indeed, I had actually spoken to Gina Raimondo, who was the Secretary of Commerce under Biden, about potentially, how to structure some of these deals. So it was not just socializing risks, but also socializing rewards, precisely learning from the mistakes that had been made in Silicon Valley. But it shouldn't just be in terms of equity stakes. That example that I gave of how I thought that the portfolio under Biden should have been structured, where you're not just kind of bailing out the downside, but getting a share of the upside. It's not just in terms of equity stakes. It's also through conditionality. For example, making sure that the prices of medicines that governments invest in are capped. By the way, that's actually in the law. So in the Bayh-Dole Act from the 1980s, once publicly financed research could suddenly be patented, so basically privatized, the government at the time thought wisely to make sure that, okay, fine, you can, take patents out if you're a university researcher benefiting from the NIH, but then the prices of those drugs should be capped, and it's called margin rights. But they've almost never, until recently, even thought about actually applying that, because unless you change the narrative, coming back to your question, of where this wealth came from, of actually seeing the state itself not just as a, de-risker, facilitator, enabler, redistributor, market fixer, all these boring words that we've convinced ourselves that the states at best, at worst get out of the way, at best you're fixing markets, unless you actually take ownership and have the confidence to say, actually, we took huge amounts of risks. And just like any venture capitalist will tell you, win some, lose some. Kleiner Perkins, when they invested in Genentech, they proudly say, oh, but before that we failed, and that's why it's good that we make the billions.
So the government should take the same approach.
Government should also, they should first of all even talk about what they do. And unfortunately, often people don't realize, again, that Tesla's early success would not have happened without the government investment. And then once you talk about it, you should make sure that the deals, whether it's the prices, whether it's equity stakes, sorry to just finish this because it's important, or even the structure of the intellectual property rights, what I talked about before. Patents are a deal between the state and the private sector. So a 17-year monopoly is what the state gives to the private sector through a patent. There should be a deal there where you then make sure that how you govern those patents, they're not too wide, just used for strategic reasons, not too deep, so hard to license, and not too upstream. If you misgovern the patent, the government's not getting its share of the deal. And again, that's just about conditionality.
But listening to you speak, this is going to sound like an insult. I promise it's not. But it is very Trumpy, right? We're hearing Donald Trump use this language like, we should get a share. We should have a right. Obviously, as you point out, he's not doing it for the right reasons. He's not doing it with the conditionality. He's not doing it with any kind of progressive goals or public interest in mind. But I feel like he's opened the door to a future progressive saying, well, actually, we can do this stuff without being accused of being a communist because the Republican president did it first. On Tesla, do you think Elon Musk in particular, but the tech billionaire class as a whole, has now been exposed quite comprehensively, has exposed, in fact, the entire whole myth of the genius billionaire?
So first of all, just on the Trump piece really quickly, the way to make the point in a, more succinct way is that he's taking equity stakes in areas he did not create. My point was not just go take out equity stakes here and there or even nationalize industries. It's you need to first create those industries. You need to create competitiveness. You need to create that kind of Silicon Valley dynamic. By the way, not just through the military industrial complex, but again, for all these societal challenges we have around water, around climate, around biodiversity, which requires huge amounts of innovation and investment. Hence, also, it can create green growth because growth is a function of investment. So he lacks that first bit, right? He hasn't even created this stuff. In fact, he's dismantling the very industrial strategy that historically in the US created these industries. He's just kind of reactively trying to look strong in the way he does by taking those equity stakes. And if you don't create that wealth, coming back to also the other question, there's no equity stakes to create in the future because you won't even have industries that are competitive.
And on Musk, my question about the myth of the genius billionaire.
So he's just one of many, who I think doesn't, first of all, say thank you enough. As a mother of 4 kids, I say thank you. I actually once tweeted he should say thank you. Then he did say thank you to NASA. And I'm not saying he even saw my tweet, but it's kind of funny because, if he did say thank you, if all these so-called tech billionaires, and by the way, I don't call them tech billionaires, I just call them billionaires, precisely because most of the tech actually came from others, not just from them. So I don't want to just say they are the tech guys, bros, and everyone else is there just facilitating them. Of course, they do also invest in the tech, but they're not the only ones. But what's important is if at least you recognize, as Bill Gates does, by the way, he often has said he's thankful to all the different investments that governments made, which allowed both he and Steve Jobs to, kind of create the industries they did. But once you recognize it, then everything else I say, like, hey, well, then let's make sure that we're also socializing the rewards and not just the risks, follows, right? If you don't even begin with that recognition, which could even just begin with a thank you, then it becomes very hard, even for governments, again, because they're constantly talking to these businesses, which then threaten them. Oh, if you touch prices, if you, mess with intellectual property rights, or if you take, stakes in the company, then we're going to leave. If you don't have that kind of confidence in the narrative and the framework, which ultimately is also an economic theory, as an economist, I actually talk about the theory that needs to change, the theory of value. Where does value come from? What does collective value creation mean? What does it mean to have market shaping and not market fixing from a policy standpoint? So that's why it's also important for the billionaires, once they make the money, to also admit all the public investments that they benefited from. Strangely, by the way, Warren Buffett is often saying he would never have made the billions he did without the social infrastructure. I mean, he's talking less about the tech, but he recognizes the massive social infrastructure that he and others have benefited from.
And Elizabeth Warren famously, when she launched her Senate campaign back in the day, I remember that famous speech that went viral where she talked about, you didn't build that road that helped you get your goods to market. Yeah. She's also called for the breaking up of big tech companies. And I wonder whether you think a future Democratic president, future Democratic Congress, if we get one, should prioritize breaking up big tech.
So I've actually talked about this quite a bit because I don't think the point is just breaking something up. It's actually breaking what I would call the rent-seeking part of that thing, because you don't want just a lot of little problematic actors. It's not just about size.
Yes.
So one of the issues with these companies, again, that you might call tech companies, but by the way, you might call them media companies as well. Just to say why language matters, right? Is Facebook also a media company? Should it be regulated like the BBC or other media companies? That's, again, a whole other conversation, but words do matter. And I think the key issue is how these rents, which are excess profits, Adam Smith talked about excess profits. That's what he meant by the free market. He said a free market is one that doesn't allow rents, which are basically excess profits where people are just making money from moving existing things around instead of creating new things. David Ricardo, Karl Marx talked about that. And so what do I mean by rents in this case? It's how algorithms are designed in the first place. So, Shoshana Zuboff wrote a wonderful book called Surveillance Capitalism, and she often says, you think you're searching Google for free. Well, guess what? Google's searching you for free. So that's an algorithm issue. And that's what we should be talking about. And in a recent project, which I called a bunch of papers as well, algorithmic rents, we looked at specifically what would have to change to make sure that companies like Facebook, like Amazon, were much more, if you want, regulated in terms of how these algorithms work from the beginning. And by the way, most of these algorithms, again, were funded by the state. If you look at the early speech recognition technology, the early large language models, they also came from DARPA. But the big thing that I don't think enough people are talking about today is because we then allowed, through deregulation, through tax evasion, massive tax evasion by these companies, but also these bad deals, coming back to how do you socialize both risks and rewards, we allowed huge amounts of money to be made by these companies. The big issue today is they have so much money, they are buying up with very high salaries people that used to work in public institutions, the DARPA institutions, the NASA institutions, public universities, and just universities in general. So this is, I would say, the first time in history, potentially, where what I talked about in the entrepreneurial state was that the state actually made these investments, which then the private sector benefited from in an unfair way, because it's good, of course, that the private sector benefits if then the results and the benefits are shared. But this is the first time in history that because of these excess rents, we have a massive brain drain, a hemorrhaging of talent from the public sector and universities. And I think one big call to action is if you're a top researcher in this space, please go back to your, to universities, to public institutions, because it's very hard to govern a process you don't understand.
Well, also, Silicon Valley is going to suffer from a lack of migrants under Trump when we get to the research area. Before we run out of time, got to talk to you about what's happening where you are in the UK, where you're based. Prime Minister Keir Starmer and his Labour government have name-checked you in the past. I know you've spoken with Starmer when he was in opposition. He's adopted a, quote, mission-oriented approach to the economy. He's borrowed your language, the language of your book since coming to government. You've said that mission-oriented approaches are about tilting the playing field towards public good and societal goals. Do you think he's pulled it off? How do you think Starmer's government is doing in the economic field? It's very unpopular. It's taken a lot of criticism from progressives. Where do you see it standing when it comes to some of these economic missions?
So first of all, a mission-oriented approach, which is what I read about in a book called Mission Economy, a moonshot guide to changing capitalism, is not just kind of spending money on technology. It's also not just about having an industrial strategy. It says, look, we got to the moon not just by spending on aerospace, but by having a very clear goal, which was to get to the moon and back in a short amount of time, and to use public money through, for example, procurement policy to catalyze huge amounts of innovation across many different sectors, nutrition, materials, electronics, which got us baby diapers, baby formula, home insulation, software. These were all solutions that were required for the astronauts to actually get to the moon and back in a short amount of time. So an intersectoral approach through an industrial strategy that's challenge and mission oriented can first of all solve problems. So imagine what these moonshots might look like around health, around, again, energy, around biodiversity.
So how is Labour under Starmer matching up to that ambition?
Well, the mission then requires that you're clear on what these moonshots actually are. And the first problem is growth is not the mission. And the first mission in these 5 different mission areas that they chose, the first one was growth. And I said, hold on a second. You can't just name check a book. You've got to read it. Growth is the result, if you get this right. Growth is a result of investment. We have very low private sector investment. Everyone obsesses about the public purse. We actually have, I think we're lowest in the G7 and we're 28th in the OECD for business investment. So what you actually need is public investment, which we're also low on. Had we invested the average of the G7 over the last 2 decades, we would have invested in the UK on the public purse side, 500 billion more. So we've lacked this public and private sector investment. And if you can use the missions to catalyze, like we did for the moon landing, but in all these different areas, then growth will happen. So that's the biggest mistake.
But what you're saying on public sector investment, it's not rocket science. You would think a centre-left party with smart people at the top of it, Rachel Reeves is an economist by training, would understand this. And yet all we've heard from them since they came to office is fiscal discipline, iron rules, no excessive borrowing. We're not going to let happen to us what happened to Liz Truss. I've even heard Labour ministers do the infamous Tory comparison of the government economy being like a household budget, which is absurd. How do you explain, after 10, 15 years of Tory austerity, after all the BS from Osborne and Hammond and all those Tory chancellors, why is Labour aping that language? What's behind? Is it fear of the market? Is it timidity? Why does a Labour government not make the case, as you just made, that we do need public investment to get long-term growth?
So there's 3 different problems. First of all is they were right to focus so much on the negative that they inherited, right? This massive fiscal hole from the Tories. But once they said it, they should have parked that and then been very positive on, well, what is our agenda? What is, your agenda in terms of the government? And unfortunately, that narrative didn't exist. And this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you don't have a strategic investment agenda, that hole will become bigger, right? This is the irony that if you don't actually have active strategic public investment in, first of all, even just a happy way to make people actually believe that this is going to happen, to increase the expectations in the business community, that there's even a kind of a market in the UK, especially post-Brexit, where the market size reduced massively, then you actually don't get that investment. And again, what is growth? It's a function of investment. So just think of the ratio debt to GDP, right? The denominator, GDP, is growth. So if you are lowering the numerator, the top bit, even to, low levels because you think you're really fiscally responsible, but you're not catalyzing the denominator, then the irony is that you could end up with what we had in Southern Europe after the financial crisis, where all the so-called pigs, I'm Italian, so I can say it, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, terrible word that Goldman Sachs came up with. But anyway, these Southern European countries were forced to reduce their deficits to access European recovery. And guess what happened? They did reduce the deficit. They were all happy. But debt to GDP rose. Debt to GDP, because X over zero.
But Mariana, I feel like
X over zero is infinity.
Mariana, I left the UK in 2015. I feel like all these arguments were had over a decade ago. Why is Labour now re-having them?
Because they're fearful. And I keep telling them, stop leading with fear, because the hole will just become bigger. And, the problem is even the so-called fear of the bond markets for global North countries. There has hardly ever been a period where the bond markets, the boogeyman, comes and penalizes the country due to an active, strategic, well-designed investment strategy. What happened with Liz Truss, one of the many prime ministers, right? We've become like Italy, very unstable here with the government. What happened with Liz Truss was that her very irresponsible tax policy, one that looks very similar, by the way, to Trump's big, beautiful bill, which is just a massive tax reduction for corporates, that will not lead to growth. Of course it won't. And the bond markets intelligently penalized her. Now, for global South countries, I don't like these words, by the way, but this is the the going word. So for developing countries, global South countries, the irony is they do get penalized, even
Yes.
for the active strategic industrial strategy. And that's the hypocrisy, if you want, behind the global international financial institutions. But for the UK, which has its own sovereign currency, which is in the global north, which at the time, basically historically has never
Yes.
gone bankrupt, because you don't go bankrupt as long as you have your sovereign currency. But if you have an active, investment strategy, can stimulate that growth that we've been talking about. There isn't really, an example where you get penalized unless you do it badly.
Yes.
So, for example, if you just create public money, out of thin air, so helicopter money, without having an investment strategy, that could lead to inflation. And that is where you'll get penalized by the bond markets. So again...
Well, ironically, the UK is about to face the highest rate of inflation among G7 nations this year, according to the forecast. Last quick question. Starmer has taken a lot of criticism from the left, from members of his own party, for refusing to scrap the two-child benefit cap, which a lot of experts say drives a lot of children in the UK into poverty. Next month, there's going to be a new budget from the government. Should they scrap the two-child benefit cap in that budget?
Absolutely. We have a very, I would say, barbaric level of inequality and child poverty in this country, and anything that can alleviate that is important. But that's not, again, enough. We need to be actually allowing many of the youth that live in certain areas which haven't been able then to enter the job market. We need to, again, redistribute wealth and think about wealth taxes in terms of bringing back that tax revenue that governments want. So instead of cutting these little bits here and there to sound like they're fiscally responsible, what we need is everything we've been talking about, and definitely alleviating the burden, not increasing the burden. And unfortunately, two other things they did early on was cutting disability allowance, but also winter fuel payments. So this has been part of the narrative problem, right? You don't come in on a progressive platform on the back of 14 years of very problematic Tory economic policy. I wouldn't even call it economic policy, just problematic policy. And then just start with these, very negative, if you want, policies that I just mentioned. And a very positive symbol could have been just to scrap that two-child policy.
So Keir Starmer said he was listening to you in opposition. I wish he would listen to you in government. Mariana Mazzucato, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Did you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications. For exclusive content and to support our independent, unfiltered journalism, head over to zeteo.com. Your support matters.